In this video, I'm going to show you how to improvise at the piano. Now, if you've never improvised a note before in your life and you don't know where to start, this is the video for you. You know, a lot of people think improvisation is just this magical skill. Either you have it or you don't, and nothing could be further from the truth. Improvisation is something that everybody can do. Of course, it takes some practice, but with the tips that I'm going to give you in this video, you're going to be improvising in no time. I'm going to give you in this video my 3 tips on improvisation that will really help you get started. We're going to show you some beginning exercises for improvisation, and by the end of this video, it's all going to accumulate in the improvisation of a blues. So let's dive in. First, I want to give you my 3 rules about improvisation that I think are enormously important. First of all, in improvisation, there is no right or wrong. Now, people coming from the classical world especially have a really hard time with this. Students are always asking me, they'll play something when we're doing an improvisation exercise and they'll say, am I allowed to do that? Is this okay? Can I do that? Can I not do that? You have to completely get away from this kind of thinking when you're improvising. There is no right or wrong. There's only what sounds good and what doesn't sound good, and that's an entirely subjective decision that is up to you. You can play something that's really extremely dissonant and funky. You can play something that's very harmonious and melodious. That all depends on your mood in the moment and is very, very flexible. Rule number 2, when you're improvising, keep going. No matter what happens, just keep plowing through. This is really important. A lot of people like to criticize. They like to play something and stop and start and say, oh, that wasn't right. I think I should have done this instead. No, really, really important when you're improvising to get in the habit of keeping the beat going. Just keep going. It's like practicing talking without any pauses in between. You just want to keep going, 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 going. This is a real important secret to improvisation. And my 3rd tip for improvisation requires a framework, especially at the beginning. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, a lot of people are overwhelmed by the idea of improvisation because it just seems like anything is possible. If anything is possible, where do you start? You have to have a little bit of a structure. You have to have something where you can latch onto it and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to improvise around. So having a framework for improvisation is going to limit your choices, but it's going to make the improvisation much more easy and, in a sort of paradoxical way, much more free. So you take a great improviser, for example, like Keith Jarrett, and you'll hear things where he, in fact, he does amazing improvisations, but sometimes just going back and forth between 2 chords. Maybe it's between a G chord and an F chord. And sometimes he can take that simple framework, going between the 2 chords, and stretch that out over 10 or 20 minutes. But without a framework, it's really, really hard to get started. So that's what we're going to do at the beginning. We're going to do a couple exercises for developing that sort of framework for learning. And we're going to progress through in sort of increasing levels of difficulty with learning to improvise. So now let's get into some practical exercises. We're going to start by establishing a framework in this first simple, very easy improvisation exercise. And like I said, this is for someone that's never played a note before in their life, never improvised a note before in their life. What we're going to do is we're just going to start with 2 chords. We're going to start with a C major chord, and we're going to start with the G major chord. We have terms for those 2 chords in music. If we're in the key of C major, we would say that C major is the tonic chord and G major is the dominant chord. Now, we're going to play those in the left hand, and what we're going to do is we're going to play half notes in the right hand along with those 2 chords. We're going to switch between C and G and C and G. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take the notes from C major, and we're going to use those same notes in our right hand to improvise. So C, E, and G. And we switch to the G major chord. We're going to use those same notes of the G major chord to improvise. So G, B, and D. So here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to just get used to playing our 2 chords, our C major chord and our G major chord. Try that back and forth a few times, and once you've got that going, what we're going to do is we're going to add 2 notes in the right hand for each of those chords in the left hand. So we're going to play, for example, C, E, D, B, C, G, D, B, and so forth. Now remember, it doesn't have to be those notes. In fact, it shouldn't be those notes. What I'm asking you to do is, in the right hand, to choose the notes of the C major chord for your improvisation. So there are always three possibilities: C, E, or G, and for the left hand, G, B, or D. We're switching between these two chords. We have a nice framework in our left hand, and I know this sounds incredibly simple, but this is going to help you get started, and we're going to add some complexity to this as we go along. So try that a few times, just switching back and forth indefinitely between C and G. Like this. A few examples of these notes. G, B. With my C chord, I can play either C, E, or G. And with my G chord, I can play either G, B, or D. And when you want to end, let's end on a C major chord. Okay? And remember, like I said, keep going, keep plowing through. No matter what happens, just keep on going. Don't stop and criticize and say, oh, that note wasn't right. If you play a wrong note, just keep on going. That's part of improvising. In fact, I'd like you to think there are no wrong notes in improvisation. There are just better things that happen and maybe less better things that happen, but it's just all part of the game. Now we're going to add a little complexity to that. We're going to do the exact same thing, but we're going to play 4 notes in the right hand for every chord in the left hand. Something like this. So we just switched between C and G in our left hand, and we added some what we would call quarter notes in our right hand. We had 4 per measure. We're playing whole notes in our left hand, 4 beats for each chord, and simple quarter notes in our right hand to go along with that. Now, just playing those notes in the right hand gets a little boring, so we're going to make it a little more interesting. We have things in music called passing tones and neighbor tones, and those can make our improvisation in the right hand much more interesting. So what that means is, like, let's say we wanted to play a C and then an E in the right hand. If we go C, D, E, that's what we would call a passing tone in the right hand. We're passing between C and E. And a neighbor tone would be if I, let's say, wanted to play C twice. What I can do is add a neighbor to that, for example, C, D, C, or C, B, C, and that actually serves 2 purposes. First of all, it gives us an extra note that we can work with, and secondly, it allows us to add more stepwise motion in our improvisation. So now, if I'm playing 4 notes per measure, I could have something like this. So I was just playing quarter notes. I added a few passing tones, and I can also add neighbor tones like this, or some combination of both. Here's some neighbor tones. E, neighbor, E, D, E, C. Okay, so start working with that. It's already starting to sound a little bit more interesting, right? Now what we're going to do is we're going to make the rhythm a little more interesting. Instead of just using whole notes or half notes or quarter notes, we're going to allow all 3 of these. So we have our passing tones and our neighbor tones, and we also now have the possibility to make the rhythm a little more interesting. Now let's combine some half notes, some whole notes, some quarter notes, something like this. Now you'll notice that we're in C major here. We're improvising in C major, and so it makes sense to end the phrases on a C. That's our sort of home base in this improvisation. That's another thing that you can keep in mind so that you have a sort of a framework in your mind while you're improvising. Now let's take this all a step further. We're going to take this and we're going to turn it into a little blues improvisation. Now, when you improvise the blues is remarkably simple because we typically in blues have basically 3 chords. We have our tonic chord, which would be in C major, the chord built on a C. We have the chord built on step 4, which is called subdominant. And we have the chord built on step 5, which we call the dominant chord. So in C major, C chord, F chord, and G chord. Steps 1, 4, and 5 of the C major scale. And we would call that tonic, subdominant, and dominant. Those are just the fancy words for 1, 4, and 5. So when we play a blues, we have a sort of a established framework for what chords come when with the blues. There's a few variations on this, and there are ways of making it a little more complex and so forth. But the basic pattern is something that we call a 12-bar blues. And here's how it works. First, we have 2 measures of the 1 chord, Then we switch to our 4 chord, and we go back to 1. Then we have 2 measures of 4, and back to 1 for 2 measures. And then at the end, we have 5 chord, 4 chord, 1 chord, 1 chord. So we have 2 measures of our 1 chord, going up to the 4 chord, back to 1. Then 2 of 4, and 2 of 1. And a measure of our 5 chord, a measure of our 4 chord, 1 and 1. So the first thing you want to do is kind of memorize that pattern. That's what we call the 12-bar blues. Now we're going to make the left hand a little bit more interesting. So what we often do with blues, instead of playing these chords in the left hand, is you're going to hear just the root and the 5th, like this for the C chord. And it's going to go back and forth between the root and the 5th and the root and the 6th, something like this. So when we have the 1 chord, we play the root and the 5th and the root and the 6th. When we have the 4 chord, we play the same thing, root and the 5th, root and the 6th, root and the 5th, root and the 6th, and so forth. When we get to the 5 chord, root and 5th, root and 6th, root and 5th, root and 6th. Okay, so let's put that all together. We're going to go through the left hand first. So we have 2 measures of 1. 1 again, up to 4, and back to 1. 4, 4, 1, 1, 5, 4, 1, 1. So now we have a basic framework that we can use in our left hand for improvising the 12-bar blues. And now we're going to do what we did before in the right hand, namely a mixture of neighbor tones, passing tones, some half notes, some quarter notes, but thinking primarily about the notes of the chord that I have. So for the C major chord, the C, E, G. When I have the F major chord, the F, A, C. And for the 5 chord, the G major chord, our G, B, D. That's our basic framework. And from there, like I said, we're going to think about maybe a few passing notes and neighbor tones. So then we put that all together and we have a simple little improvisation that sounds something like this. Now, if you're having trouble with that, you might want to simplify it even more and say, I'm just going to play quarter notes in the right hand, or I'm just going to play half notes in the right hand. Or maybe you just want to stick to the notes of the chord. The important thing is give yourself a really clear framework for improvising. That's really going to help. So to summarize again, the 3 most important rules of improvisation. Number 1, there is no right or wrong. Number 2, keep going no matter what. And number 3, give yourself a clear framework for improvisation. I hope this video helps you get started with improvisation at the piano. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you again in the next video.